a psychotherapist and a sex therapist. I specialize in working with um, all kinds of people that are outside of kind of the heteronormative, like the narrow track, which I think includes a lot of different kinds of people. So people in marginalized sexual identities, orientations, gender expansive, as well as lots of different kinds of like diverse sexual practices and expressions. So it covers a lot of ground.
So you kind of specialize in marginalized sexual communities, basically.
Yeah, yeah. So also including sex workers, also including um, people who identify with having out of control sexual behaviors, lots of different stuff.
I want to ask you, being that you focus on groups that feel the stigma and judgment, I'm sure the most, why do you think it is that societally we're still so uncomfortable with sex in general, especially if it strays from that story and stereotype that we are deeming appropriate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like that you keep using the word stories because I feel like so often people come in and are asking like, what is this normal? What is the norm? Or I'm struggling because I know that I'm outside of the norm. And I'm like, well, you tell me what the norm is because it's news to me that there is one, I guess because I see so much diversity in people's desires and expression. That a lot of people I would say most people on some level feel that they're not normal, that maybe most other people are like this, but I am really um in my own little category and I don't fit. In terms of like why we still struggle as a society, I don't know. That's kind of my answer. I feel like we're so mired in shame, and I think sexuality has been a realm in which we have used that kind of like shame and evaluative judgment to control different populations, different demographics of people. Um, for so long, I think that um, it just really plays a role, and that people have a lot of these kind of unconscious scripts, like we're talking about these stories, that we're raised with that maybe we even inherit from, our parents or the communities that we grew up in, religious communities or other social groups that we're in that that really play a large role in dictating like how we think of sex and our own sexual selves. And we don't even know that those stories are running. It's very much in the background. So I think it's a lot of unconscious uh, material that's at play, and feeling like this can't be okay. I think sexuality is also a realm in which we can be very wild and creative and have this like expansive imagination and sense of play, and that can feel really dangerous. It's not very controlled in that way, right? Like it's not fitting with the way that we've constructed our culture of like, where there's kind of this heteronormative path and everybody's supposed to sort of be in this groove. And any sort of like deviance from that, um, whether that's non-monogamy or kink practices or being queer or having different kinds of sexual desires or expressions, any little step off of this path, um, including even being asexual, I want to include that, or aromantic, because I think that gets left out sometimes. There's like this social pressure to like get back in the groove.
Yeah, that is something that I also find really interesting because as human beings, we're so wired for connection, and we're actually like herd animals, to be honest. We want to be part of the tribe, we want to be part of the group. So when we feel like there's something about us that's not accepted, it's one of the most painful feelings I think that a human being can experience. There's a reason why isolation is one of the strictest punishments that we give to people. We send them off to jail because it's really hard on a human being to be isolated. And so I think that when you mentioned social pressure to get back into the commonly accepted narrative, whatever that is, I think that makes a lot of sense when you look at it from the eyes or from the perspective of we want to have that connection and bonding with the group. How do you usually advise your clients who might be dealing with this very issue of, I've discovered this about myself, but it is so contrast to what I've been doing or what I've thought was right or what I've learned. And now there's this dissonance and conflict in them. If someone's listening and they have that, like I have this secret about my sexuality, but I don't think my partner would ever accept this or understand, or whatever the case is, what would you say is one of the first steps in trying to resolve some of that dissonance and disconnect within themselves?
I think, I mean, the kind of like easy answer is working towards self-acceptance. And I think that sharing it with somebody is one way that we do that. And I think also a place where Live Jasmine really serves a role in that, and that, maybe there is just this one person in this space that's outside of your normal, like your daily social circles, um, where it can feel safe to talk and be accepted and to take risks, maybe to try on different roles that you never would try on in other places in your life. I think there's like a lot of potential for play and exploration and trying things out, and it can feel lower risk in that space than maybe in, our everyday lives.
Absolutely. I mean, I honestly believe one of the reasons why platforms like Jasmine are so wildly successful is because people have found a place where you're allowed to talk about sex in whatever way you want to talk about it. It's accepted, it's encouraged, and we just don't have that many places in our day-to-day life. We certainly don't have that many people in
Yeah.
general where, yeah, you can just talk about your fantasies, sex, or hear someone else talk about what they like, what they don't like. It's very interesting and such a primal part of who we are.
Yeah. I think you really hit the nail on the head, is that it's just not like considered, it's not acceptable to talk about sex in most spaces. And if we do, it's often in this kind of like coded language, or it needs to be really like tidied up and cleaned up and, made presentable in this very particular way. And it makes me think about, actually, when I was becoming a sex therapist, I went through this whole process, like the first, I don't know, year or two. I was taking on this title, and I went through, this extensive training program, and to become ASEC certified, which is like our governing board, is like this whole process. It's like it's a big process. So it was like years of work, and I'm working really hard towards this, and I had to like go through this kind of like coming out process in myself of like, am I gonna tell my family that I'm now doing like a sex job, that I have to like, I'm making business cards and they say my name and then sex underneath it, and like I really had to make peace with that. And it took me a minute. And it surprised me how much that brought up conflict for me, because I never considered myself to be, particularly conservative, or I don't know, buttoned up in that way. And I was like, whoa, but this is big to like really associate myself professionally um, in the realm of sexuality. What are people gonna think? Uh, So I get it. Yeah.
And
It,
how was that journey for you? Did you feel accepted? Did you feel like you faced stigma or judgment?
oh yeah. I mean, there's actually I always joke about like, if I'm on a plane and someone asks what I do, like I'm pretty uh, you know, judicial about like what I decide to tell people. There's always that joke of like saying what you're an accountant, right? No one will ask you any questions. Um, yeah, it's something that I don't always disclose just because I don't necessarily want to have whatever like conversation comes afterwards. So it's, not even that it's necessarily like a negative response, although I think I do get that too. It, it's just that like people have so many different feelings about sex and working in a field of sexuality, that there's still, I think, a lot of stigma and just reactivity to it.
Yeah, you're not the first, and I'm sure you will not be the last sexual health professional, wellness professional that has told me that they themselves, as a professional, experience stigma and judgment because
Yeah.
they work in the field of sexuality, which just, I don't understand it at all because sex and sexuality is literally part of our primal makeup. It's
Hmm.
almost like a doctor being like, I have to be quiet that I'm a doctor because I help people heal. You know what I mean? Like, well, of course,
I
that's
think
fine.
like because it's primal, that is part of what feels risky about it. Like it's part of like our animal selves. And I think that that is part of what makes it feel unruly, in society, like that part of what makes it feel threatening.
I shouldn't be, but for some reason, I'm always surprised when I hear a professional tell me that they're still experiencing stigma. Do you post on social media? How is that?
It's a wild ride. I was just say, like, I'm also surprised to hear myself say it, that I still experience stigma. It's like, but yeah, that's true. Like I'm thoughtful about who I share it to and where and, how I present myself. Um, Social media is a wild place. I do have an Instagram account. Um, I decided to take a break. I think in July I was like, I'm just gonna give this a rest, and I haven't gone back yet, so we'll see. It's been a couple months. Um, One thing that's been really interesting about it is that well, I get a lot of like private messages about things, people asking questions or sharing that something I posted was meaningful to them or felt helpful, but they won't, comment or like on it publicly. Um, and there was part of why I was getting discouraged for a while with my feed because I was like putting, a fair amount of effort in writing these things that I was like I cared about and wanted to put out in the world. And I was like, it's just not like getting much response. Of course, there's like the shadow banning of Instagram. That's its own complicated mess. Um, but also I have found, I mean, just over and over again that people I know in real life in some context will just kind of like discreetly come up to me on the side and be like, by the way, I love your Instagram. I follow everything. And I'm like, that is wild because I've never seen you interact with anything on there. Um, so a lot of people kind of follow it in secret, which is still surprising to me, but I hear that a lot.
Yeah, that's a really great example of where we're still at. The fact that people that you know
Yeah.
are telling you, I love it, but they're not willing to like it publicly or comment on it publicly because they themselves are afraid of being judged for enjoying something that is promoting sexual information.
Yeah. It's really sad. You think about it. I mean, the fear that we live with of being even associated with yeah, a friend's Instagram that's about sexual health and mental health.
Yeah.
Yeah. That could feel like a threat. to people's families or jobs. Yeah, it's intense.
I know you mentioned at the start of our call that part of one of the marginalized groups that you work with is sex workers.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if they have shared or if you've noticed or picked up on a recurrent theme of a struggle that they tend to have.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's this that we're talking about, right? It's like how to manage um, how other people are perceiving them, not the people that they service, the people that they work with, um, but more like family and friends. Um, yeah, I'm thinking of some people I've worked with recently who like love their work and it's so rich and they have these relationships with people that they've been seeing for years and years and it's a very authentic connection that isn't emotionally impactful for them and they can see that they're like helping their clients. It's very therapeutic. Um, and yet they struggle a lot in their personal lives with like having to do it undercover, feeling like they can't come out in the profession that they're in to their family and friends, and that they truly could stand to lose quite a bit if they did. It's with good reason that a lot of times that people make that choice. I understand it, and I hate it for them because it's very stressful to try to live that double life, maintaining both.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can't wait for the day when we're all just like, forget it. Let's just all be ourselves.
Right?
Don't care. Obviously, the models on Live Jasmine have a very similar experience where many of them feel like the work that they're doing is extremely meaningful. I actually interviewed a member 2 weeks ago who had suffered a severe heart attack. And one of the side effects of his heart attack is that he now gets panic attacks and
Wow.
anxiety, bad anxiety. I guess it's a very common side effect after you've had a heart attack. And he said there has not been one time that he hasn't gone into a particular model's room who he has a connection with while he was having a panic attack, and that attack did not subside.
Hmm.
When you hear that, it's like you mentioned, this is therapeutic. There is more going on than just sexual or explicit content.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about coming into this interview. I've been kind of obsessed with the concept of third place lately, like third places. Do you know this term? It's like places that are not home, not work, but somewhere else that's like you can kind of just be there and um, be relaxed, be with other people, be social. In live Jasmine chat, it's like not exactly the definition of it because it's kind of like places that are sort of open and public and you can kind of be free to come and go, but it's similar. And I think it maybe serves a similar purpose in that we so these spaces have been like declining in our you know physical space, our cities, our country, I think globally, for a while, and also kind of being replaced with like virtual spaces, and um, we so need that kind of space to just like be at ease with other people, and I think that Live Jasmine can really potentially provide that kind of space where someone could just sort of drop in, maybe have a regular kind of contact with somebody. It's kind of like their own lounge, their extended living room. Um, and yeah, I just love the idea. I think about it in terms of like parks and cafes and here in New York, beaches and um, yeah, and the idea that like I think in interacting with models, you can also kind of be practicing like um being with people and being in conversation and also like negotiating this sexual field together and what kind of play are y'all going to get up to. There's a sense of like creativity that's there. The two of you are like co-creating this improvisation together. That's quite socially skilled, to do that with another human. Um, and so yeah, I can see how it really serves that niche, that need.
It's interesting that you brought up third places. I hadn't actually heard of that concept in that term, but obviously, yes, when you mentioned like, your local cafe that you always go to get work done or something like that, it's interesting because I have interviewed members who are like, yeah, my favorite model's room is like, it's like a bar where, they start engaging with other members and the model's chatting with them. And sometimes it just becomes like a fun party that they start having, you know?
Well, that totally fits. Yeah, that
Yes.
makes
Yeah.
it's like they talk about like barber shops and places like that, like place where you drop in and there's like regulars, and
Yep.
so
It's like,
yeah.
hey, Mitch, where have you been? And like, oh, I was on vacation. Like, that's the feel that they described to me. In fact, one story that one of the members told me was in one model's room, they had developed such a community that there was a couple that used the site together with this particular model, and she went into labor. And during the labor, I guess he was like, "We're almost there. The baby's coming," in the chat
Oh,
room. And they were like, "Oh, yeah, congratulations." I was like,
oh, that's so sweet.
wow, that's really interesting that, he wanted to update everyone in that room, like, we're having the baby. And
It's
yeah,
a
just that,
community.
yeah, community. And a lot of the members, what they share, if they're in a particular model's room, most likely they all have that model in common. They enjoy, for whatever their reasons are, that person. And so they find common ground, at least with the enjoyment of that particular model.
It's
But
interesting because I one of the things I also specialize in is group dynamics. Like I really like facilitating groups and leading groups, and uh, paying a lot of attention to how members interact with each other and with the leader of the group. And so as you're describing that, I'm like, that feels so familiar because when I'm leading groups, I feel like a lot of the people will show up really to talk to each other. I mean, I'm there and I'm sort of like orchestrating and holding this space. But yeah, they're just like, it becomes like a very meaningful place for them to drop in and just chit chat and catch up with like, what happened this week? Where have you been? What's been going on?
yeah,
What did you do about that thing you had going on at work last week? That's really cool that that happens in the chat rooms too.
yeah. It's, in some cases, it really becomes community, which, as we talked about earlier, is something we as humans crave very deeply, to the point where at times we're willing to almost betray ourselves to stay in good graces with whatever community we've been in or want to continue being part of.
Yeah.
Also, you mentioned how it could potentially be skill developing, to go back and forth with the model. And that is something that I've also heard from the members, is that they kind of learned how to, one member told me he didn't know how to talk to women. He had never experienced asking a woman out before. All of the relationships he had been in, those women had approached him because he was too shy to approach women. But because he started going back and forth with a particular model who kind of started telling him, well, women like this, women don't like that, and they would kind of role play, he
Oh,
told me
nice.
he had confidence. Now he asks women out. If he's out and he sees someone he likes, he feels like he has the confidence to approach that woman.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Then yeah, it's so cool. I feel like most people could use that kind of practice, you know? Like we all get it somewhere, right, at some point, but like that's really a skill that you have to build over time and you have to learn it somewhere.
I'm telling you, one of the things that I always say I love about models on Live Jasmine is their soft skills, those communication skills, those understanding how to read someone, how to mirror someone. They go a long way because those are the skills that create resonance with people. And again, that's what we crave the most. But you're absolutely right. Like we have to get socialized somewhere at some point. And if we don't, we suffer because we don't feel connected.
Yeah, and I think that our world has, um, we were moving more and more virtual, as I was saying before. And um, I mean, I realize like we're here talking about a virtual space, but I think that for a lot of people, um, this has been very isolating, like I'm thinking about kind of the effect of like moving toward remote work, and the convenience of it and the accessibility of it is obvious and adds a lot, I think, to people's lives. And at the same time, we don't naturally we don't have that like organic kind of contact with people that we do when we like go into a workspace. Um, and so I've been finding, especially since, the pandemic, when when so many people went virtual so quickly, I've had a lot more conversations with people who are like, I'm really happy with my job now. It's so much easier. I feel so much more comfortable and at ease in my home, and I can do work in this different way that I like. Um, and at the same time, I have not even the first clue of how to make a friend, and people are like super isolated and feeling like they don't even know how to take the first step. So being able to like connect with people in a video space um is such great practice.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's safe practice because, it's practice. You're not really at the coffee shop trying to, you know,
Yeah.
and have more control over the situation because if you feel bad, you could click out of it if you really needed or wanted to. Whereas in person, it doesn't work that way as much. I mean, you could walk away, but it's not quite as easy to remove yourself if you're feeling like you need to.
And the space is being held and curated by a professional. Like this is a like professionally social person.
Mhm.
So like that person's really going to help facilitate this thing happening.
Absolutely. I'm telling you, that's what I love about the models. They know exactly what they're doing. They really do.
If they're like good at what they do, they know how to help people feel at ease and feel comfortable and, joke and have that kind of just banter and relax.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's why this industry, and it's particularly Live Jasmine, that's obviously the site that I know the most about, has been so successful because there is such an emphasis on relationship and connection. I'm curious if you have noticed a common block or theme to sexual wholeness or wellness in your patients or clients.
I think shame is probably the biggest unifier that I think of. Um, that so many people struggle with this idea, of is this okay? Am I okay? Are my desires normal? Um, or the way that I am, like, is it acceptable? I think that's really what people are asking when they're like, am I normal? It's like, can I be accepted for who I am? Um, I think yeah, I see that coming in all the time in all kinds of different ways. It feels like that's kind of the first stage of sex therapy is really just feeling like the permission to be who they are and just to like voice it to somebody else is already, lowering that sense of shame, like to take the risk and say it out loud and then to have acceptance reflected back. Um, that's pretty huge in and of itself. Sometimes that's all people need, you know.
We've definitely seen that on the site. Sometimes people just needed to talk about something. There are members who thought they were interested in a particular fantasy, but once they acted it out, they realized that they actually weren't, but they needed to know that. Otherwise, if they
Mhm.
had had the freedom to go there, they'd always wonder or, you know, think that maybe it was for them and they were denying themselves something. And when they did it, it was like, you know, it's not for me. But at least
Yeah, and there's so many, it's important, I think, to have space for like a fantasy world that is like rich and like totally feral and unbound by societal rules. And we can keep that for ourselves, and there's we they don't think that, we get to choose like which parts of that do we want to maybe share with another person. Um, and that the story of like someone coming in and thinking they want to act out a particular fantasy, then they do, and they're like, oh, that was better as a fantasy. Like sometimes that's totally true. Like I think a lot of times, um, people are like, this is really good as a fantasy. And maybe just so or not so great as like fully acting it out, but you don't know until you try, right? But sometimes the fun is just like sharing it with another person.
absolutely. Why do you think that having a rich fantasy life is so important?
I think that it's like a place that's just ours, it's like this well of um creative energy, erotic energy that is just for us, and we get to have a relationship, like a sexual relationship with ourselves and our minds, our erotic minds. Um, and we don't owe it to anybody else, I think is the important thing. Like we can choose to share all or none or whatever, but the fact that it's like it's not it's no one is entitled to it, I think is really important. This is something that comes up in couples a lot or in relationships, where I really make sure that that's an idea that I'm like driving home, that each person in the relationship gets to still have their own like solo sexual life. And that might even include like camming with a model or having whatever kind of solo sex practices that feel like nourishing to them, right? And that's of course gets negotiated in the relationship agreements of various relationships. So I think those agreements are like, all different for every dyad or triad or whatever. Um, but regardless of what those agreements are and how like the external behavior that comes from those desires, I think that we get to have our world of desires and arousal and fantasy and play, that just belongs to us.
What I like about what you're saying and the fact that, it's important to have this fantasy world that is yours and that you know so well is that it means you have to know yourself sexually. And I think that's one of the keys is if you're even able to have these rich fantasies, then that means that to some degree you've explored that part of your sexuality, your mind. And I think that is so important for people to just go there. If you're thinking something's a little weird, that's okay. Check it out. Even if it's just internally, you don't need to check, like you're saying, you don't have to check it out in the outside world. Sometimes it's not even great that way.
Yeah.
Explore it within yourself and see what that is and what's going on there.
And that's how we get to know ourselves sexually, I think.
Yeah.
Is by having that. I guess that maybe that's the answer to the question of like, why have that? Why do I think that's important? I think that helps us to know ourselves better.
Yeah.
Um, and when we know ourselves better and know our desires, um, we're just better informed in how we want to be in the world and be in relationship with others. The fact that people come to your site and they get to really meet like a real person is so important, and it it humanizes like our sexual desires and fantasies and practices too. Um, I just think that, yeah, that's such a rich resource for people.
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
My final question for you is your perspective and experience. What are our next steps in creating a more sexually healthy society?
Hmm. I think, yeah, for me, it's all about like diversifying what we uh see as possible and as acceptable. So just like I'm biased in that way, and that like I just want to like widen and widen and widen, include more kinds of expressions, more kinds of acceptance for fantasies, identities, sexual practices. Um, and I think that uh, you know, requires education and exposure. And also I think this kind of like humanizing aspect of, you know, uh, sometimes people are able to broaden their perspective of something when they actually meet somebody um, who identifies in a way that they maybe previously held beliefs about, some kind of negative judgments about, but then they like emotionally connect with this person and feel that kind of like empathetic connection. It's harder to stay biased. Um, so I think that forming connections with individuals and getting to know them is a big part of understanding how much diversity there really is in sexuality.
Yeah, and again, in life, we are just not the same. Many of us, I stand by it. We're like snowflakes,
Yeah.
like every snowflake is different. I mean, literally, if you get down to the DNA and how DNA mixes, it's actually scientifically a fact that no one is the same. So,
Mm,
yeah.
I believe it.
Take my word for it. Thank you so much. This has been a
Yeah.
great interview.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.